In 1968, the Raiders were just one small step away from making it to the Super Bowl in back-to-back years. Many think that the talent on that Oakland Raiders squad could have beaten the Baltimore Colts and that the Raiders, rather than the Jets, would have been the first AFL team to hoist the title away from the NFL. But it was not to be. But this show is not a revisit of the darker times. Today, we will celebrate the love-in and love fest for all Raiders fans that has simply become known as the Heidi Bowl. We'll take a look at the events leading up to the game itself, including the thrilling climax that was wiped out all across the eastern seaboard, and the boiling aftermath, how it affected football, and especially how it affected televised football contests on Sunday afternoons, particularly in the Eastern time zone. I'm your host, T3 Raider Facts, and this is episode 13 of the T3 Raider Roots podcast. As a backdrop to everything that unfolded late in the 1968 season, the Oakland Raiders and the New York Jets were alike in many respects. Both were founding members of the American Football League, which started play in 1960. Both teams played in major market areas where there was already an existing NFL franchise. New York City had the Giants, whereas the San Francisco 49ers resided on the other side of the bay from Oakland. Another quality that they shared is that starting out, each had poor records and were not managed properly. Likewise, they each had a savior who almost single-handedly turned their respective football fortunes around. Sonny Werblin in New York and Al Davis in Oakland. Both the Raiders and Jets were coming off successful seasons, and due to the fact that they played in separate divisions, both teams were favored by many to challenge each other for the AFL crown in 1968. The Raiders were returning from their best season in franchise history that resulted in a 13-1 record and a berth in the second Super Bowl. The Jets, led by Joe Namath, their now established star quarterback, and the toast of New York City, were a team on the rise, and they were packing in the fans for each of their home contests in Shea Stadium, located in Queens. Perhaps the one thing that rose above all others is that the two teams genuinely did not like each other. Frank Ramos, director of Jets public relations, once commented that when the Jets played the Raiders, it wasn't a rivalry, it was a war. Jets guard Randy Rasmussen had also been quoted as saying that anytime we went into a Raiders game, we knew we were going to come out sore, guaranteed to get the crap beat out of us. They, the Raiders, were a tough physical team. Dislike isn't the word I'd use to describe how we felt about them. Downright hatred would be more accurate. Even though they were in different divisions, the teams usually played each other twice a year. This allowed the Raiders and Jets to forge a bitter rivalry which started to catch fire on television. There was a growing history of bad blood between the two teams. Oakland's managing general partner, Al Davis, when he arrived to the Raiders in 1963, had traded guard Dan Ficca to New York during training camp without mentioning to the Jets coaches and management group that Ficca wouldn't be released from his military service for another 6 weeks. So the Jets acquired a player they couldn't even use until later in the year. This did not sit well with the Jets organization. 3 years later, in Joe Namath's second season, with less than a minute to go in the contest and the Raiders leading at the new Oakland Coliseum 28-20, the Jets scored a touchdown with less than a minute to go in the game on a draw play that caught defensive end Ben Davidson out of position. The play resulted in a 47-yard scoring run by Emerson Boozer. After a 2-point conversion tied the game, an angry Ben Davidson vowed to get even and set his sights on the following season, 1967, when the teams would play each other twice. One of those contests, the Week 4 matchup in Shea Stadium, turned out to be the Raiders' only regular season loss. Then, in Week 14, each team's next to last game, they met in Oakland. This late season contest was one of the most vicious in Jets team history. Namath was hit late often. He was punched. The Raiders defense aimed for his ailing knees, and they even tried to step on his hands. And finally, Davidson got to Namath. On a play where Namath had rolled out to his right, Davidson hit the quarterback, sending him flying one way and his helmet the other, allegedly breaking his jaw in the process. Even so, the star quarterback threw for 370 yards and 3 touchdowns in a losing effort that ended up knocking the Jets out of first place in the East and subsequently no playoffs that year. After the game, Davidson had said that he didn't think his tackle broke Namath's cheekbone, but that he didn't care. He said that Namath had been beaten up worse by girls and that he was just asking for it. Ill feelings were then resurrected by an immense blown-up photograph posted at Raiders headquarters showing that same particular play with a helmetless Jets quarterback flying toward a crash landing, courtesy of Davidson. Although the poster, which had been strategically placed by Al Davis, was removed before the 1968 contest, word of this intimidation through photography reached the Jets organization, and they were not happy about it. Namath stated that he liked the Raiders the least of any AFL team. There was a lot riding on this game. Going into the contest, each team had lost only 2 games. The Raiders were behind the Chiefs in the West and needed a victory to avoid falling a game and a half back. With no wildcard team at the time, the Raiders could finish the season in second place in their division and be knocked out of the playoffs. The Jets, on the other hand, could clinch at least a tie in the AFL East with the win over the Raiders. In the late 1960s, few professional football games took longer than 2.5 hours to complete. So a 3-hour time slot was allotted for the Jets and Raiders on November 17th as part of a doubleheader on NBC. The game was to be televised to most of the country beginning at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, with Kurt Gowdy and Al DeRogatis providing the color and play-by-play. NBC hoped that viewers who turned their TVs to the game would stay on and watch the evening's featured programming, which was a special presentation of the children's classic Heidi, which was scheduled to air after the game at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, preempting the regular Sunday night staple, Walt Disney's Wonderful World of Color, which was normally shown on NBC during that time slot. Since the game started at 1 p.m. Pacific, the western half of the country would have to wait until their 7 o'clock time frame to begin Heidi. Under television rules at the time, the Jets versus Raiders game was blacked out within 90 miles of Oakland, even though the game was a sellout, leaving KRON Channel 4, the local NBC affiliate, and other nearby markets unable to turn the game on at all. Heidi had been promoted heavily by NBC in television commercials and also newspaper advertisements. The network had hoped to gain a large audience, especially among families who they anticipated would watch the entire 2-hour film presentation. Individual commercials for the program could not be purchased by advertisers. Instead, the entire 2-hour block was sold by NBC to watch manufacturer Timex, which would air the film and have its own commercials spread throughout the broadcast. It is ironic that a watch company, the sole sponsor, would be at the center of a controversy of a game whose ending was cut off simply because the network ran out of time. The Central Nerve Center for NBC was known as Broadcast Operations Control, or the BOC. Dick Klein, the network BOC supervisor for sports telecasts, prepared the series of network orders which would result in the game running as scheduled, followed by Heidi. Klein had no reason to believe that the game would run over 3 hours. No professional football game presented by NBC ever had. However, other NBC executives continued to stress that Heidi must be started as scheduled because the event had been well sponsored and also well promoted. Don Ellis, the game's producer, objected because, as he said, "I've been trained never to leave a game in progress." Ellis was overruled. This was just one of a handful of mistakes made. NBC ran 3 BOCs, one in Burbank, California, one in Chicago, and the largest one in New York City. Klein was stationed in New York. In the era before satellite transmission, programming was transmitted by coaxial cable line with the cooperation of the telephone company. For this game, the Burbank BOC was to receive the feed from Oakland, insert commercials and network announcements, and then send the modified feed via telephone wire to a switching station just west of Chicago. There, an engineer was stationed to activate the Oakland feed into the entire network when the game began and to cut it on instruction. He'd been told to expect a network announcement 1 minute and 40 seconds before 7 o'clock Eastern Time. The network announcement was for Heidi, which was the signal to cut the feed. Then the Heidi feed from New York would begin. This placed Burbank in effective control of whether the engineer would cut the feed, acting upon hearing the announcement. Meanwhile, Klein's boss, John Scotty Connell, was watching from his home in Connecticut. His superior, NBC Sports Vice President Chet Simmons, was also watching from Manhattan. The San Diego Chargers were playing in Buffalo against the Bills as the first part of the doubleheader. That game was running a little long in its 2.5-hour time slot, and NBC cut without hesitation to the marquee matchup of Raiders versus Jets. On the opening kickoff, the Jets were penalized for a personal foul against the Raiders. The Jets scored first on a field goal, then increased their lead to 6-0 on another Jim Turner three-point kick. Then the Raiders, led by Daryle Lamonica, who'd been battling recent back and knee ailments, scored the game's first touchdown on a 22-yard pass play to receiver Warren Wells that put the Raiders up 7-6 toward the end of quarter number 1. The Raiders then added to their lead on a Daryle Lamonica to Billy Cannon 48-yard pass play early in the second quarter. With the extra point, Oakland led 14-6. Namath then took the Jets on a long scoring drive, moving the team 73 yards before running the ball in himself from the 1 with just 5 seconds left in the first half. Backup quarterback and holder Babe Parilli then tried a fake on the extra point, but his 2-point conversion pass attempt fell incomplete. The Raiders went into the locker room at halftime, leading 14-12. When the teams returned to the field after the half, Namath began a Jets drive after the defense had intercepted a Daryle Lamonica pass. The drive resulted in halfback Bill Mathis scoring on a 4-yard run. The extra point made the score 19-14 in favor of New York. The Raiders then responded with an 80-yard drive of their own that saw running back Charlie Smith score on a 3-yard pass from Lamonica. The Raiders then extended the lead to 22-19 when Lamonica completed a 2-point conversion with a short toss to Hewitt Dixon. During this drive, Jets safety Jim Hudson had been called for a face mask penalty, and when he then got into a dispute with one of the officials, he was ejected from the game. Hudson had angrily left the field, shooting the middle finger to the Oakland crowd upon his exit. The ball was placed at the Jets' 3, and Smith scored 1 play later. The fourth quarter began when Smith fumbling the ball deep in Jets territory. When the Jets recovered, Namath then engineered a 97-yard drive consisting entirely of his passes to Don Maynard, who was being covered by rookie cornerback George Atkinson. First, Joe hit Maynard on a 50-yard pass. He then followed that up with a 47-yard scoring strike to Maynard, which put the Jets back in front 26-22. Jim Turner then added another field goal for the Jets, pushing the lead to 29-22. The Raiders again answered the call as Lamonica orchestrated an 88-yard drive, culminating in a 22-yard touchdown strike to Fred Biletnikoff with less than 4 minutes to go in the game, tying the score at 29. When the Jets got the ball back, they drove down the field, and Turner notched a 26-yard field goal to break the tie, giving the Jets a 3-point lead with just 1 minute, 5 seconds left in the game. Turner kicked the ball off to the Raiders' Smith, who returned the ball out of his end zone to the Raider 22. Then the network went to a commercial. No one saw what was coming next, literally. Behind the scenes, Connell and Klein had been following the action very closely. They observed that there had been many incomplete passes, scoring plays, penalties, and injuries, all of which resulted in clock stoppages. At halftime, the two had discussed, although without any real urgency, the fact that the game seemed to be running longer than expected. But as the fourth quarter began at around 6:20 Eastern Time, the NBC executives started to realize that the game might not end before 7 o'clock. All the while, the network kept promoting Heidi. Despite being told by Julian Goodman, the president of NBC, going into the weekend that Heidi had to start on time, the network execs were beginning to feel the heat. At around 6:45, Connell called Klein, and the two men agreed that the game would not end on time. Both supported running the end of the game, but given Goodman's instructions, they knew that they needed express permission from the president to make this happen. Connell agreed to call NBC Sports president Carl Lindemann, and he and Lindemann would then speak to Goodman together. When Connell contacted Lindemann, the two agreed that the end of the game should be broadcast. Then they reached out to Goodman. They then asked the network president, what about the instruction to broadcast operations control that Heidi had to go on right at 7 o'clock no matter what? Goodman replied, that's crazy. That's a terrible idea. Lindemann then quickly set up a three-way conversation with himself, Goodman, and NBC television president Don Durgan. After several minutes of discussion, Durgan agreed to delay the start of Heidi until after the game was completed. It was later noted that even though all the executives had agreed earlier that Heidi should start on time, they all changed their minds at the last minute. Klein, watching the clock nervously, attempted to call Connell, only to find that the line was busy. He waited as long as he could, then made one final last-ditch attempt. What Klein didn't know is that Connell was talking to Goodman, who had agreed to slide the network, that is, to start Heidi as soon as Kurt Gowdy signed off from the game. Connell called the game producer, Ellis, in Oakland to tell him the news. Then he called the BOC supervisor in Burbank. Ellis, not knowing who Connell was, refused the order and insisted on speaking to Goodman directly. They just ran out of time. Beginning about 6:45, just 15 minutes before all hell broke loose, many members of the public began calling NBC and affiliated switchboards. Some were demanding that the conclusion of the game be shown. Others wanted to know if Heidi would be starting on time. These calls jammed the switchboard and blew out all the fuses, preventing the executives from getting through to each other to resolve the situation. By the time the game had ended at 7 minutes after 7, the Raiders had scored 2 touchdowns in 9 seconds and went on to win the game 43-32. The 2 late touchdowns meant that the Raiders had won by more than the point spread of 7.5, so many bets that people thought they had won were actually lost, and vice versa. In Oakland, Gowdy and DeRogatis left the broadcast booth to tell Ellis that the final 2 minutes were the most exciting they'd ever seen. Ellis replied, "It's too bad America didn't see it." Realizing that the original call had been lost, Ellis had the 2 sportscasters recreate their descriptions of the back-to-back Raider touchdowns on tape. For the millions of viewers who had already been switched over to Heidi, the natural assumption was that the game was over and the Jets had won by 3. In an attempt to inform the audience of the game's outcome, NBC displayed the message, Sports Bulletin, Raiders defeat Jets 43-32, as an on-screen news update scrolling across the bottom of the screen during the film. It did so during a scene just as Heidi's paralyzed cousin was attempting to take her first slow steps. Football fans screamed in outrage when they saw what they'd missed. The Heidi audience screamed in outrage that a football score would intrude on one of the story's more important and touching moments. No one was happy, except for the Raiders players and fans, many who actually saw what happened. At 8:30, Goodman issued a statement apologizing for the incident, stating that he had missed the ending of the game just like everybody else, and said that it was a forgivable error committed by humans who were concerned about children expecting to see Heidi. The following morning, Klein was called into a meeting with his bosses. He was told that if he had done anything other than what he did, NBC would have been at the mercy of the Timex Corporation, and Klein would have most likely been fired. The network then did its best to turn the epic failure into an advantage with self-deprecating humor. They promoted the following week's Jets game with an advertisement showing Namath with Heidi on his shoulders and another ad with testimonials about how great the production was, including one that was singled out prominently. It said, quote, "I didn't get a chance to see it, but I hear it was great," unquote. It was signed by Joe Namath. Other networks joined in the fun as well. On the CBS Evening News the next night, Harry Reasoner announced the result of the game by saying, "Heidi married the goat herder." On the ABC Evening News, anchor Frank Reynolds read excerpts from Heidi while showing clips of the Raiders' 2 touchdowns. Even NBC, on its Huntley-Brinkley report, aired the tape of the game's final minute, completed with a recreated Gowdy-DeRogatis commentary, followed by the apology by NBC. In the aftermath of everything that had happened, NBC installed special Heidi phones with a connection to a different telephone exchange from other network phones to ensure that network personnel could communicate under similar circumstances if this should ever happen again. The game also had an influence on sports broadcasting practices. The future NFL would contractually stipulate that all game telecasts be shown to their conclusion in the markets of the visiting team, while other major leagues and events adopted similar policies. It's interesting to note that just 3 weeks after the famed Heidi game, NBC aired a special presentation of Pinocchio, a live-action version starring Peter Noone, the lead singer of the rock band Herman's Hermits. In the promotional advertisement before the event, Pinocchio himself assured football fans that they would view the entire game before Pinocchio would begin. The character even said that he would sooner cut off his nose rather than have them cut off the game. Then on December 15th, the nationally televised game between the Raiders and San Diego Chargers ran over its allotted time slot. NBC started the new adventures of Huckleberry Finn at 7:08 Eastern and announced that all network programming that evening would be started 8 minutes late, the first time anything like that had ever been done. The Jets were angry about losing the game, but were not aware of what happened on and off the television until much later. Assistant Walt Michaels chased down the officiating crew and started banging on their dressing room door, bitter about the fact that Hudson had been ejected from the game and that his replacement had given up the late touchdown to Charlie Smith. Head coach Weeb Eubank learned of the television problem when he received a telephone call from his wife back east congratulating him on the win. He uttered a few curse words and hung up the phone. She didn't know. Likewise, the father of Jets cornerback Johnny Sample met his son at the Philadelphia International Airport the next day with congratulations on a big Jets victory. He had no idea. Klein summed up the events of the Heidi game. Everything had to be perfect. It was just a series of events that fit together. The game ran late. There was a lot of scoring. There were some injuries that stopped play. And if the Jets had won, there would not have been the to-do that was made. But the way they lost fanned the flames. The bottom line, don't take away my football. Thank you for joining me on this special edition of the T3 Raider Roots podcast. In our next episode, we will take a look at the year 1969, the final year of the American Football League. There were so many contributors to this edition, but I would like to thank in particular NFL Films, the NBC Sports Archives, Murray Olderman, Mark Grabowski, Joe Schuster, George Usher, and Paul Zimmerman. Make sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel, T3 Sports Guy. Go back and watch all the other episodes to get you caught up on Raiders history. You can also catch me on the Only Nation podcast, found on most major podcast platforms. Until next time, just remember, passion always outlives fashion. And here's wishing you a bright silver moon shining in the dark black night. Take care, everybody.